Hello everyone and welcome to Your Library at Home. My name is Sam Hagan and I'm part of the library's public programming team. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we meet on country. I live and work on Gadigal land and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present and especially emerging. And I also extend my respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us today. Thank you for joining us. And welcome to this talk, which is entitled Some Space to Write. We present today in partnership with the Sydney Review of Books. The Sydney Review of Books is a journal that publishes critical, creative, ambitious and engaging writing on contemporary literature and culture. And we are so pleased to be able to champion our fantastic writers in partnership with them. I'm going to be short and sweet. I'm going to introduce today's conversation facilitator, Tom Lee. Tom is Director of the Masters of Design at the University of Technology, Sydney. His explorations of aesthetics in Australia are shared on Instagram with the handle @TheAustralianUgliness, which is also the name of his blog. His first novel, Coach Fitz, was published by Giramondo in 2018. And I'm about to hand over to him, but I just do want to let you know that I'll be back here at the end of this discussion to ask any questions that you may have, which you can type in the Q&A button down the bottom. But right now, I'd like to hand over to Tom. Hi, Tom.
Thanks, Sam. Cheers. Hello, everyone. I just want to also echo Sam's thanks there to the Sydney Review of Books for setting up this event, and also the State Library of New South Wales, and also in paying my respects to the traditional owners of this land, elders past, present and emerging. I'm just going to introduce our fantastic panelists first, and then we'll go through with a number of specific questions to each of the panelists, and then we'll have a general discussion towards the end. So Eileen Chong is the author of 8 books, 2 of which were nominated for, shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, and her work, her book Burnt Rice, is taught as part of the HSC syllabus. Welcome, Eileen.
Hello.
Now introducing Linda Javen, who's written 11 books, and her first book, Eat Me, was a bestseller. Her most recent books are The Empress Lover, published in April 2014, and the non-fiction Beijing, about the city and its history. She's working on a short, or actually, in fact, I think it's the shortest history of China. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you.
And our third and final panelist, or fourth if you include me, is Oliver Moll. Oliver's the author of A Line Attack. He's published over 60 works nationally and overseas. He was the winner of the Scribe Non-Fiction Prize for Young Writers, and he's currently working on his second novel. Welcome, Oliver.
Thanks, Tom. Pleasure to be here.
Cheers. Well, so the focus of today's discussion is broadly on the places, spaces, and practices of writing. We're going to focus on the essays that were written as part of a series for the Sydney Review of Books, but I'm sure all of the authors will elaborate into other elements of their writing practices as well. To begin with, I've got a question for you, Linda, in your fantastic essay, and I've chosen you to start because when I was reading through it, it's a fantastic, and I read it earlier in the year, but reading through it again now with the kind of view of me being a facilitator of a panelist, there's so many pithy and provocative statements about what writing is and what travel writing is specifically. So I thought that was a really, choosing a few of those is a really good way to kind of begin a discussion. And at one point, I think you talk about struggling to write with all of the distractions of the fires during the most recent summer. And there's the kind of atmospheric distractions, you know, the real presence of smoke in proximity to the fires, but then also there's the virtual sort of distractions coming through the Fires Near Me app, and the letters that you feel obliged to write to politicians as well. So all of these kinds of distractions. And you say something, you say the best places for writing are those that fade from consciousness as the landscapes of the imagination take over. And I was wondering maybe if you just say a little bit more about what what are what are those kinds of places? If there's a specific example of a kind of place that comes to mind, or if there's a general characteristic of multiple places that are like that kind of fade from consciousness as the landscapes of the imagination take over.
I think that for me, place comes in two kinds. And one is the place where you can write, and the other one is the place where you're just being stimulated and you're observing and you're so interested in everything. So you're watching everything, you're looking at people. I can't write well in those circumstances. I write, but I look at it and it's a mess, it's just impressions. To write, I need a place like the study I'm in, and what you can't see is that my desk, it began against a wall, and then it's moved into the center of the room because all of the walls, there's a few filing cabinets, but it's just all books. I'm going to be that person who, when an earthquake finally comes to Sydney, you're going to find me buried under all the bookshelves, that have just collapsed into the center. But what it is, it's a fantastic, it gives me such comfort. It's very familiar. This is very important. It's familiar, it's comforting. And there's a lot that can stimulate me, all the books and everything else. And I've got a nice little window view of the cafe across the street so I can see, who's out there. But it's so familiar, it can just fade away. And I could do that sitting on a park bench in my park. And I can do that in Varuna, which is very beautiful, but it's also familiar enough. And I think, you can sort of transplant yourself. I did go to the Tyrone Guthrie Centre in Ireland for 6 weeks once. And it was fantastic. And that was super stimulating. It was this castle and it was full of fantastic Irish artists and, and writers and musicians and theatre people. And the landscape was beautiful. But it did have that atmosphere of when you want it, it will disappear. And then what's in your head, taken from all those other places, can come to the fore.
It's interesting that you mentioned Varuna, because there was another another kind of pithy line from your essay about Varuna specifically, the perfect combination of being beautiful when you look up, but then invisible when you look down. And I think just what you've sort of said there, and this kind of relates to all of the essays in a way, that writing takes place for many people at the kind of intersection between overstimulation or intense stimulation and then deliberate inhibition from that intense stimulation in order to go into the writerly mode.
Yes, I would say that's definitely true.
Working out those kinds of rhythms. I might just ask you one more question, Linda, and then I'll flick to you, Elaine. Specifically about travel writing. And the idea of going to a place to capture its essence, or the notion of the authentic. So I was, as a kind of a writer who focuses on travel, there must be a temptation to try and capture that essence, or at least have some kind of close acquaintance with it. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the tension between the sense that you've really experienced a place. And I think, these questions are really relevant now with COVID, where, we're prevented going lots of places. So the sense that, you've really been there, you have to go there to be able to talk about it. And then the competing sense that places are changeful and mixed and kind of impure, and the sense that maybe they don't have essences or identities in the way that we might come to think of when reading certain travel guides. I was wondering if you talk a little bit about that tension.
I think that when I do travel writing, I do two kinds. One is when, in the past, I've done a lot of writing for Qantas magazine. And so they send you to some place and you're not, so I'll give you an example. I was sent to Borneo, and I was sent to a river place, and also to Survivor Island, where there's a very lovely, sort of very fancy kind of spa resort. And so in the spa, that I was writing about the spa resort primarily. And, I'm not there to sort of capture anything ultra essential about Borneo, but to get the atmosphere of the beautiful trees and the cuisine and the, everything about being in this villa on this island that's so beautiful, and have a little bit of fun with it and make it individual, be very specific about your own experience. But the other kind of travel writing, while I was on that same trip, I took a little excursion on my own to a cave that's known for the swallows that make the nests that Chinese consume in bird's nest soup and things like that. So this place, we're warned, it's really, really disgusting. As I said, it puts the grot into grotto. It has the highest concentration of cockroaches in the world. They're just, the walls are crawling with cockroaches and poisonous centipedes. You're wearing a hard hat so that if dead birds or bats or guano, anything comes down, it's not going to get in your face and your hair. You're wearing one glove so that if you slip on this slimy it is truly extraordinary. Qantas, I said, oh, by the way, you sent me on this trip. I did this thing. Do you want it? No. No, people don't want to be sitting on a plane reading about a lot of cockroaches. But then you can have a lot of fun because it was a very, very specific experience. I'm not saying I'm capturing the essence of anything. I'm saying this is what I saw. This is what I experienced, including the masks that we were given. Mine melted immediately from my sweat. It just kind of fell apart. And the guy goes, oh, they're not much good anyway. They don't really prevent, the smell. And at the very end, there was this transcendent moment where bats flew out of the top of the mountain in this beautiful stream with bat hawks coming to eat them. And there was an orangutan with a baby on the mountain. And it was just like, wow, so all you do is you try to capture what you actually have experienced. Get rid of the cliches. Don't worry about what it's supposed to be or making any grand statements, this is the nature of the people of Borneo. I don't know. I know what the guide was like and I described him.
So yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Like it's about a certain amount of atmospheric or sensory richness. You don't really need the concept of an essence or of authenticity. It's just about a kind of a kind of richness and complexity that you get from direct experience.
Yeah, with also always and hiding this, as I think Oliver and Eileen would know this, you hide your research. Sometimes you put it in the front, but you do your research. So it seems like I've just kind of entered this cave, but I actually did a lot of research before and after on Borneo, on bird's nest gathering, on all sorts of things. And that just stays nicely in the background and informs your work. So you don't want to be there as just gathering sensory input and then putting it out without having any sense of history or context. I think that's also important.
That makes sense. I think the metaphor that kind of springs into my head is like when you kind of sand a surface in order to get it ready to take oil or something like that, or like roughing something before you paint it. So reading something just readies the mind for absorbing the details.
Great metaphor.
Eileen, I've one question for you. It's quite a straightforward question, and I hope it's not a one that kind of is paralyzing to think about. But you mentioned, it was really interesting to me in your essay, that you speculate about if you hadn't have left Singapore, where you spent a lot of your childhood and early adulthood, that you may never have become a writer. And I was really curious as to why you thought that might have been. I know it was just a speculative statement, but I was wondering, what were you thinking when you wondered that?
That's an interesting question. I might just respond very quickly to Linda's. I just had so many ideas.
Fantastic.
I'll lead into your. I will answer your question. I'll just lead into it. And I thought it was really interesting what you and Linda were talking about in terms of, and this is what Wordsworth always talks about, that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. The notion that you have to experience something and then to recollect it. But also I felt like, the point about research and writing is very valid, but that for me personally, the best writing is like watching a ballet. That there is there are lots of technicalities behind the dance, but you see none of the effort.
Exactly.
So that's very important to me, and in that work kind of appears almost effortless, even though it's crafted. It looks effortless, and I think that is the balance that many writers try to achieve. With regards to Singapore, I mean, I don't know if any of you know a lot about Singapore, but it is in terms of the arts, I would say it's a very young society. It's a post-colonial society. It's a very young society in terms of the arts. And when I left Singapore, it's not the most conducive environment for artists or writers, I feel, in terms of having freedom of speech, in terms of having art as a viable career or an option. Often, I don't actually know of many. I know of a few, but not many full-time writers in Singapore. Many of them have government jobs or are lawyers or, you know, some sort of civil servant, and they write on the side. Now, I was never clever enough to get a scholarship. And Singapore is a very relentless society when it comes to its education system. It is a, you know, its people are very highly educated. It is a education system that prioritizes the sciences and maths. We're one of the top societies in the world in terms of maths ability. And needless to say, I was not one of them. So the only thing I was really good at was English. And so by the process of elimination, I became an English teacher. And it was just never a viable option. And yesterday I asked on Twitter, you know, I asked people, are you the only writer in your family? And, you know, I got many responses, and some of them would say, oh, you know, the great-great-great-grandfather was a writer, and so on. I'm the only writer in my family that I've known of ever. My brother is an artist. He's a very successful artist. His name is Heman Chong. And my mother was a bookkeeper, and my father worked in clothing. And to this day, I don't know what they did right or wrong to have two children who are artists. So yeah, I was a very happy and very successful at my teaching career in Singapore. And the backstory is that I would never have become a writer if I never moved to Australia because of an accident. I came to Australia wanting to be a teacher, but then because of some miscommunication, I wasn't allowed to teach in Australia, also partly because Australia doesn't consider Singapore to be an English-speaking country. So my double degree in English language, in linguistics and English literature, and my diploma in education in the eyes of Australia was pretty much worthless. Even though I topped my university, I got a British Council gold medal. That didn't matter. They wanted me to take an English qualifying test, and I absolutely refused because because I was proud. And then someone said, well, you know, if you get a degree from an Australian university, you could probably teach. So I went and got a Master of Letters at Sydney University, and then I became a writer by accident. That's when I met Judy Beveridge, and I became a poet, and the rest is history, I guess.
I'd be interested to know, actually, just from the other panelists, you mentioned there not being another writer in your family. I'm curious, Linda and Oliver, are there other writers in your families?
My parents were shopkeepers, and you know, did business, and that was it. And my grandfather, I had a pharmacist grandfather, and yeah, businessman. I mean, they didn't. No, there was no, as far as I know,
yeah.
You know, people who run away from other countries like my grandfathers did, don't tend to keep very good, very long genealogies. So maybe my great-great-great-grandfather was a writer, but I will never know about it.
Somewhere back there, potentially. Yeah. What about you, Oliver?
Yeah, my family, yeah, no one, I mean, people write, but they wouldn't say that their profession would be a writer. But yeah, no, my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor who, after the war, ended up writing a book called How God Hoodwinked Hitler. And then he went on to become sort of a pretty I suppose in certain academic circles, yeah, a famous sort of sociology and religion academic. So yeah, he wrote 20 books, so I think he qualifies as a writer. I'm trying to catch up to him. Yeah.
Yeah. So has that influenced you in part? Does he kind of loom in your mind when you think about your vocation?
I wouldn't say explicitly, but I do have he passed away several years ago, and at the funeral, he was a very like quirky man. After the war, he would never eat potatoes again because that's all they ate in the prison, and he would take wine from really expensive wine bottles and pour goon in it, and then invite people around from the university and serve them the wine because he thought that was funny. I just collected a bunch of his stories about growing up, and yeah, and I read them at his funeral, and I put it on his writing jacket that he always wrote in, which is all patchy and, you know, really old, mothbally. And yeah, I'd like to say for a while I was wearing it. I wore his writing jacket a few times because I felt like I wanted to channel something. The energy felt really nice, and yeah, but I think as a direct sort of correlation or experience, I found it interesting perhaps that it was my first taste that you could write it. There was proof that it could be done in a tangible way that I could touch and see and feel and experience. But that was probably more indirect than direct, I think. There have been other sort of mentors in my life that have proved that for me. So yeah.
Cool. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, on that sort of a related note, thinking about the writer's jacket, Eileen, you've got this. There's a lovely moment in your essay where you talk about being able to see a small patch of sky from your study where you work, and seeing that sky through the window, I presume, allows you in a way to kind of travel away from your desk and place yourself in the surrounding area. Like, I think you mentioned the bay and the park and the dogs. And, you know, there's kind of two questions really. There's one, do you need a window in order to write, or does a window help? And then the sort of the sort of more complex question, I suppose, is, do you find that you need sort of certain things in your place of writing to enable you to kind of to float out of that place and to leave us? Does that help?
You know, place doesn't really matter to me, physical place, so much, because as a poet and as someone who's moved around a lot in her life, it really is between me and the page, or me and the laptop. So I don't even really notice my surroundings. And for a time after the end of my relationship, I was also briefly homeless. And I wrote much of my third book while homeless. And, you know, it was just me and my laptop, and in various places I wrote by the sea pool at Maroubra. My friends put me up for 2 weeks in their basement, and I was just writing in a windowless basement. And it doesn't, so the physical spaces don't matter as much to me, I suppose. But what matters to me is the space of the poem, the world of the poem. I tend to hold the poem in my head, or the elements of the poem in my head. And obviously many different poets work in many different ways, but I walk around waiting for all the elements of a poem to coalesce before I sit down to write it. And it doesn't mean that when I sit down to write, I know what's going to come, but I just know when the space is right, the psychic space of the poem is ready to be uncovered. And then I sit down and I write the poem, and it might be a successful exercise, it might not, I never really know. And I don't know when the poem is finished until it finishes. So I think it might be quite a different experience to several people when I talk to other writers about writing, especially prose writers. You know, some prose writers work from structure and, you know, an overarching chapter outline and things like that. For me, it is almost entirely a process of almost automatic writing, of trusting the process, and that the fact that I'm not in the driver's seat when I'm writing a poem. And it's obviously very different when I'm writing a prose essay or a review or something. But in a way, I feel like a lot of my personal essays follow the same process in the same psychic space as when I write a poem. That being said, I do really love my study, and I wanted to link it to your essay, Tom, about wanting to lie down when working, because if you can see, my study is a very small space. It's a little mezzanine space. It doesn't even have a door or walls. So, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. In this instance, it's not really a room, but when I moved into this apartment and I saw this little mezzanine space, and I just said, first thing I'm buying are bookshelves and a sofa. It's a very small space. The sofa takes up more than half the room, but if I can't lie down to read and to think, I can't work. So when I come to the desk, it is really to do paperwork, invoicing, emails, and almost everything unrelated to the actual crafting of a piece. Most of the time I'm lying down reading or thinking or sitting on my couch, and there's always cats on me or on the couches and so on. So I wanted to talk, I know you're the host, Tom, but I also feel like your essay deserves some conversation. If you don't mind me asking the question, and
please.
Oliver was also next, but I was really keen to talk about your essay and how you talk about parks and that you would want to lie down in a park, and also the transient nature of the people who come into the park, the community of park goers, almost. But also I find it extraordinary that as a female woman, as a woman of color, I don't feel safe in parks. And I know this is a privilege for some people to be able to.
It's not a privilege for women of any kind to lie down in parks.
Right. And I would never close my eyes, because you just don't know who's going to come up and touch you or something. So that's interesting to me, that you, as obviously as a white male, you feel like parks are safe spaces, safe communal spaces. And I love kind of the notion of you writing in these communal spaces or coffices.
Mm-hmm.
So would you be able to talk about, and given your position as someone who's interested in design and architecture as well, could you talk a little bit about the park as an office space?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very interesting. I've certainly had similar comments from other women who I've shared that essay with, or shared my habits of working in those shelters with, about some people seeing kind of untoward activity going on in the shelters at times, which makes them feel threatened as well. Like, I think I posted a shot of one of the Bronte picnic shelters up on Instagram, and a follower said, like, oh yeah, it looks lovely, but I think I've seen somebody having a wank in there once, so I'll never want to go anywhere near it again. It almost ruined it for me hearing that story, I must say. But it's interesting. I think I live in an apartment with no garden, and I think that gradually and it's been great during the COVID stuff, because I'm not going into work continuously. Like, I'm increasingly being and living in my suburb and my locale, and it's like the more time I spend in nearby parks and in a suburb, the more it does kind of feel like a quasi garden to me. And I have this kind of, I think, well, why not? Why shouldn't it just feel like it is my garden? Like, why, I live in the most magnificent garden in the world, is kind of what I tell myself. And I can just, I can go down to the end of my garden where the fence is at Bronte Beach. That's how far it extends. And I can do the things that I would do in my garden in the park just behind Bronte. So I'm sort of trying to convince myself that I live in the whole suburb is my garden in a way. Obviously it's the commons as well, and it can be other people's garden also, but just to get that level of comfort there through doing things in it that you would usually only do inside a house. And I think it's happened to me gradually, where I think to begin with I wouldn't have dreamed doing some of the things in public there. I mean, nothing too untoward, but just the idea of bringing down a whole heap of thermoses and cutlery and apparatus to stick on the. I think I would have been tentative to do that for a while, but now I do feel at home in there, and I feel like I have. I mean, territorialized is a nasty word in some ways, but I feel comfortable in that space because I've done so many things there, and nothing bad has ever happened. So I feel like it's been a process of making myself comfortable there and working on my back on the computer and yeah, really just inhabiting that space as though it is my garden. Yeah.
Well, you don't have to ever mow the lawn.
Yeah, exactly. It's all these advantages. It's the best of both worlds. It really is. I mean, and sometimes, you know, the worst that can happen is a dog that runs along and it puts its paw in your strudel or something like that. That's about as bad as it gets. But I love the fresh air, and I find it so hard to be in enclosed spaces without fresh air for a long period of time. And I think I have this sort of slightly psychosomatic thing going on where I give myself kind of unpleasant feelings if I sense that there isn't fresh air, and then that creates this kind of feedback loop where I'm like, I've got to get out of here, I'm going insane. Yeah, but yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for the question. I think yeah, and I'm gradually extending the garden as well. I think Bondi and Tamarama are soon to be incorporated in its outer reaches. Oliver, before I'll quickly shoot to you, and then we can just have a rolling discussion. Maybe there's so many things that I'd like to come back to in a way that have already been discussed. But I had a slightly different question for you, Oliver. Like when I was reading Train Lord, I was really not puzzled. It's not curious about the tone, and like when I started reading it, I was like, how serious is this? On the one hand, it seems deadly serious, and it doesn't seem like a kind of particularly ironic piece, but at the same time, there's this sense of kind of playfulness or yeah, something slightly not cryptic necessarily, but you sense that you're not quite getting the whole story of what's going on when you're talking about your time working on the trains. I was like, was he really working on the trains as a guard, or is this some kind of allegorical piece? And I was just wondering, like, in terms of the tone of your work, are you doing kind of, are you deliberately avoiding a particular kind of tonality, or are you deliberately trying to kind of employ a particular kind of tone or voice, or is it just you? It's just how you write?
It's probably just how I write, but I think on that, I mean, you know, everything comes from somewhere. So I would probably, if we're going to go surface level, I would say like the things that I'm talking about in this piece, and more largely in the play that I turned it into, and then the book that I finished, deadly serious, and it almost cost me my life. I almost killed myself because I had a 10-month migraine and no one could help and no one could say what was wrong. And yeah, it was like really traumatic. So for me, it was kind of like, how do you write about trauma, and how do you enter spaces of trauma? One way to turn a writer or a reader off really quickly, for me anyway, is to be super serious and try and say, look at me, pity me. Like, you know, for me, humor has always played a huge part in my life. Sometimes too much. With this essay, I thought generally it would be better if I can make someone laugh, and I can make you be interested in the, I don't want to use the word quirkiness, but the ordinariness of life, and I can keep you sort of reading and reading, then I can reveal things at certain times that are going to be quite shocking. But in a way, it's sort of like what Hannah Gatsby says about tension, right? You relieve tension and you create tension, and that's all the story is. You're sucking the air in out and you're taking it back in. So if I look at this essay, which I think, yeah, a lot of the writing I did, I'll just rewind a little bit. I started working for the trains because I couldn't do anything else. Even though the migraine had disappeared in the early parts of 2016, I still had to learn how to sit in chairs, look at computers, look at phones. I couldn't do anything, basically. There would be small moments where I could, but then the pain would come back and it would be horrific. So I got a job on the train through the necessity of, I literally couldn't do anything else. It was terrifying to me, having once been a writer and lost that identity, that I wouldn't know how to make any money. I wouldn't know, I was useless basically. But the trains offered a solution whereby I didn't have to look at a screen. I liked the idea of traveling around Sydney. On a larger narrative level, I loved the idea that I needed to travel around and around and around in circles so I could figure out how to love myself again. It paid really well, which was a plus. So I suppose as I started to learn to trust my body again, and this is a whole nother different story that I don't think we have time to go into now, I started writing in a notebook, just a tiny little notebook, and I would write in between stations while working on the train. I like short paragraphs anyway. I think you can contain everything you need to in, say, 4 sentences if you do it right. But if we talk about place and about setting, I was riding on a train between stops, which were about 2 minutes. So everything I was writing came out in this very specific way because that was the time that I had allotted myself. So I guess, I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but the tone, I don't have an answer to the question of tone, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I just say, I thought the tone was really great. I was captivated from the beginning to the end. You start out with what we learn in train school, and it's like, what? Yeah. This whole thing about train school, and then this kind of joke, and you're like, is it a joke? Is it not a joke? The teacher says, what are you going to do if you've had your break and you have to go and use the toilet? Mm-hmm. And somebody says something like, shit in a bag or something, and the teacher laughs, and it's like, well, was that the answer? Was it not? And I immediately got in that very first paragraph that the funniness of it and the kind of oddness of the situation and your displacement within this situation where you were with all these people who are training to be train guards or perhaps other people on the train. And I loved your essay. I thought it just from beginning to end had a fascinating tone because, as you say, I love that description. You suck the air out and you pump it back in, and it works for me.
Yeah. Elaine, you've got your hand up there.
I am once a school teacher, always a school teacher. So hand up. But I just wanted to say that as a poet, I don't read a lot of. My first love is poetry, and I read about 6,000 poems a year for work and pleasure. And when I do read prose, it's nonfiction, and it takes a lot for me to want to read prose. And I will say that as a poet, when I read Oliver's essay, I was deeply, deeply moved, and I didn't get the sense, I saw the humor in it, but I didn't get the sense that, is this serious? Is this not serious? That didn't matter to me as a matter of craft, because as a poet, what I look for is the undercurrent of emotion. And Oliver's essay just for me had this deep emotional truth in it. And it was partly disassociative, but it was also partly, poets look for what is unsaid, what is left unsaid, the negative spaces in a work. And Oliver's work, I feel, had that, deep ramifications of everything that was unsaid. And it was this deep undercurrent of pain in the process of writing, pain in the process of not writing. And I don't know if you're familiar with this wonderful collection of travel essays by the Singaporean Australian poet, Boy Kim Ching. It's called Between Stations, and literally talks about trains and stations as liminal spaces. Wow. And the act of travel as liminal spaces. So I just thought here was an actual real life manifestation of liminality in Oliver's life and in his life as a writer. And he's actually physically, on these trains and belonging to a similar group of people who are also sharing this liminality in different ways. I feel like there could be, multiple stories about everyone who worked on that train. There could be a collection of short stories with 50 stories, and you still wouldn't uncover that. And that these spaces are spaces that all of us pass through and share, and everyone has a different experience of a train or a train journey. And I just thought that was incredibly powerful. So thank you for writing.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly, moving to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, go Elaine, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to also say about Linda's essay. I've already got my questions prepared. So is this the time to
go for it? Yeah.
Yeah. So Linda, I really love the notion of when you were talking about in your essay, when you talked about looking out the window and seeing the back of an apartment block and how intimate that was, seeing a woman put her bra on, and I wanted to ask you questions about, what you thought about the transgressive nature of writing was, the notion of of Peking, and also of your own personality and your own body as a site of transgression, because you're a Chinese scholar. You speak Mandarin?
Oh yeah. I
And
speak, read, and write. Yes.
you speak, read, and write. So my question is, when you're traveling in China, how many times did you hear Chinese people shit talk in front of you in Chinese without them thinking that you understood it?
Countless, actually. And I remember some of the earliest ones were when in the 1980s, when there really weren't that many non-Chinese who spoke Chinese and who were in China. There weren't not that many non-Chinese hanging out. And you'd be on a bicycle, and there would be, I remember once these two guys are like, we're in the stream of bicycles, going along the street in Beijing. And there were these two guys in back of me, and they're like, Western women,
老外, 老外.
they'll just do it. They'll just do it. They'll do it for anybody. They'll just, and I'm sitting there going, oh my God, just shut up. And they just kept on. And one of them was like, do you think we should, hey, maybe she'll do it with, and I just kind of turned around and I said something really rude to them, and they sort of fled, It was very funny. I've had a lot of experiences.
I love that. That's great.
I just wanted to pick up on that, and that, this is actually a parallel experience for many people of color in many situations, especially people of color who are white passing, to hear shit talk about people of their race or different races, and then you kind of go, well, hang on, my parents are from, it's harder for me, but there are many people who are white passing, and just the notion of the transgressive nature of language, that or the act of writing. Are we, what is our responsibility as writers? What can we write about? What are we allowed to write about?
Well, this is a really interesting question. And Oliver, did you want to answer it, or I'll say something after you, because I see you.
Yes.
I mean, this goes larger than my essay, but it is something I've been thinking about a lot. What are the story? A lot of my book basically kind of came from the perspective of what stories are we allowed to tell? I know that I'm a white straight male writer, and that I have a certain sphere, and I suppose for a long time that crippled me, because I didn't know how I could tell my story when that intersected with other people's stories, especially when they were women or other men or whoever have you. And they're very delicate questions. So for me, and I don't have any easy answers, basically. I'm still sort of going through the second draft of it, but those specific questions of, how do you tell a story that intersected with yours, potentially saved yours, maybe destroyed yours, but isn't yours, knowing that you own the copyright to your own narrative, and each person owns a copyright to their own narrative. So how do you, because you have the narrative here in this circle, and you have real life over here in this circle, and they are different things, but they often overlap in very interesting ways. And I need to think about it further, but they're very interesting.
I've thought about that a lot, and I think that it's very important to me to act ethically. So when I'm writing nonfiction, if it touches on somebody else, then I absolutely have to have their permission to write about it. If I think there's something that, something has happened in my life, it's very important. It needs to be written about, or it demands to be written about, or I want to write about it. But to write about it in a nonfiction form would violate that person's privacy. I process it into fiction, and processing means stripping that person of identifiable things. And what's really interesting about that, it's not just an exercise in legality, it's an exercise in finding the essence of what it is about that person or that interaction that was so effective, that was so that took over my brain. Why is it? What is that quality? And sometimes it's a quality of something about the way the person speaks, and you can even switch genders, you can switch everything, and you end up very far away. But then that becomes, as a fiction writer, the kernel of a character. So I've taken something from somebody in real life. There's nobody who could look at that and say, oh, that is that person. It's really important to me. And to answer your question also, Eileen, is I think that there is this thing now you know, you have to be so conscious of your privilege, of your this, of your that. And I occupy a very sort of, I feel like a middle space in some ways, because half my life was lived in China. And I'm writing a new novel that's set in China, and some part of me is going, you can't write Chinese characters anymore because people are going to jump on you, you know, because you're not Chinese. And then I'm like, but these were my friends, these were my enemies, these were my lovers, these were my, you know, everything around me. And it was my experience. And so I kind of have to keep claiming it back, but also asking, well, when I write this person, I don't think, you know, I think it's very different from somebody saying, oh, I'm going to write a story about this magical, wonderful, beautiful, you know, Chinese woman, and I'm the rescuing man, or, you know, it's you have to kind of ask these questions. And I think I've interrogated myself so much that I've practically paralyzed myself in the writing of that particular novel, which is not a good thing, but yeah.
That'll happen.
Yeah, I obviously think a lot about, you know, these things, both from my position as a woman of color, but also as someone who grew up in Singapore of Chinese descent. Because if you know anything about Singapore, I mean, in terms of my ethnicity, I occupied the position of power as in my race. In Singapore, the Chinese people are essentially white people in Singapore in terms of power. So for me, the core of this question is about power. You know, are you taking, by writing about someone else or writing in the persona of someone else, are you taking away from their power? Are you essentializing them? Are you culturally appropriating something? And if the answers to those questions is yes, then don't write it. But then I think what, Linda, you're talking about is very much about cultural appreciation and a deep understanding, because you lived in China, you speak Chinese, you write Chinese, you studied Chinese history. And I think, you know, there is no one, you know, right or wrong. No one gives out a pass to say, you can't write about this, you can't write about this. You have to be the interrogator, and you have to take that responsibility as a writer. So I often write in persona in many of my poems, and I've written in the voice of Mary Wollstonecraft, I've written in the voice of Mary Shelley, and I think to myself, oh, should I really be writing in the voice of these women, you know, because I'm not white? But then I think, you know what, I've spent so much of my life reading white work, and I've occupied this world, and what I bring to this narrative is a slightly different take to it. And basically, I guess the summary for me is that you punch up, you don't punch down. Yeah, so do you have any take on this, Tom, in terms of
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the power asymmetries being a huge part of it. And I think consent is another big part of it as well. Like if you are including somebody else in your story, or if you're worried about it, then you give them what you've written and see whether they mind. I think, and it's certainly something that, as an academic at the moment, some of my work, you know, writing about research that goes on at university using a fictional mode has been a really interesting experiment in this sense, where, you know, writing about a design project at a university, and you're writing in a non-fictional way, and there's ethics clearances that have to go with that because it's part of the kind of university protocols with regard to ethics. But if you're writing fiction about it, that changes things. So I've had a couple of interesting cases where it's like I've got the same content and then playing around with what you need to do in terms of abstraction in order to make that story not about the research, and like this, just playing around, like I was thinking about it when you were speaking, Linda, that like you either kind of distill what's there into something in a kind of in a more abstract form, or you create something new by creating these new modes of abstraction. So for example, in a design project, they might be working on a specific thing. Say it's making a new blender, designing a new blender. And then in the fiction story that I'm writing about, you just avoid naming the thing. You know, this new products that we're working on. And then all of a sudden it starts to become a little bit kind of Kafkaesque or something as you make those moves of abstraction. So it's there's scope for experimentation around those issues as well. But yeah, I think the consent side of things is a big part of it. Yeah.
And this is the process of creativity, isn't it? That the art of looking at something sideways, that we're talking about one thing, but we're also talking about another thing, that the notion that writing is a stand-in for the real experience in some way. And that, you know, there is a thin veil between, you know, the work and the world. And I'd really love to hear from Oliver around whether any of his train mates knew that he was a writer.
Yeah, well, just before we get into that, I think it's interesting, to add that, you know, when we talk about fiction and nonfiction, exactly like you said, a big thing for me trying to write about trauma is the fact that you will never be there, and you will never experience what I experienced, just in the way that any person would not be there for anything that anyone has experienced. And so we come up with these words and we put them on a page and we call them a story. Oftentimes fiction is more truthful than nonfiction in many ways. For me, these terms, and I'm fascinated by them, and I'm a lot more eloquent in my writing about it than I am talking about it in real time. But yeah, I think it is important to remember that we are taking everything through our senses, and we are putting another version of that out there. And that is an interesting thing to note, that just because you say something is nonfiction or fiction doesn't make it any more or less true than anything else realistically. I didn't tell anyone about that I was a writer for a long time on the trains. I didn't want to, for me at that point, it was a life that I'd left behind. I was figuring out how to read notes so that I could pass a train exam. And then at some point, and the other, I would also like to thank Sydney Review of Books as well, because the only reason I'm, obviously here, but even have this second book done and have this show and a bunch of other stuff that have happened is, because of Sydney Review of Books, because of Catriona. She asked if I wanted to write an essay, and I was floored because I hadn't written anything for a long time. That's a little side note. But no one knew, and I didn't want anyone to know. And for a long time, I rejected the label of writer. I didn't want to be a writer. I wasn't a writer. That was something that had died.
I wanted to ask you about that, Oliver. Actually, there's some really interesting kind of complicated relationship you have with the vocation of a writer. Yeah, so it'd be great to hear you talk about that.
I'm fully back now. I figured out a lot of my pain, a lot of it, it's all stress, and it's all where self-worth comes from. And people tell you have to have a thick skin, but I was so young and I had no mentors. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just sort of freestyling it, and it worked till it didn't. Now being older and 32 and have, like, I took a very large break, which in the end was probably, really beneficial, but there was a sort of like a death for me anyway of the old creative self. And what we were talking about before in terms of creativity, and I was very much before sort of outcome focused. I put everything on the final product, but now I view creativity very much like a religion, or it's a spiritual practice in many ways. And interestingly, when I left Sydney for the first time and moved back to Brisbane because I couldn't live life anymore because of my head, and Mum would read me books from the couch while I would lie there with like heat packs and trying to massage like the pain away. And she read me Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, and she of course wrote Eat, Pray, Love. And at the time I was like, Eat, Pray, Love? Like I don't, come on, like I'm off it. I wasn't into it. But she was reading this stuff about how, pre-Renaissance, the genius would visit you. People weren't geniuses. And so therefore, when the idea visited you, or the deity visited you with the idea, it fused with you, and you entered into a contract where you spent time together and you produced the work. And when it left, it was done. And after the Renaissance, people became geniuses. So when you couldn't produce work, when you failed, mental health spiked, suicide spiked. And I found that really, really interesting. And then I guess for me, on writing these essays, and I do view them a lot more like, I have a very challenging relationship with perfectionism, but I've actively this year been trying to be extremely anti-perfectionist.
Writer has to be in the end. It is everybody's struggle. We want to be perfect, but at some point you have to finish the thing.
Yeah, and this was what happened to me. I was like 70% through on this book. I was asking all these questions about what stories can you tell? How can I make people feel this? I don't want to make people hurt, but I want to give them a sort of sidebar experience of something. And if I have to use fiction, a metaphor, a simile to get you there, and if I have to pull the wool under your eyes and tell you that something that you think is real is not real, but there's an overarching reason why I'm doing that, because you can never experience the thing that I'm trying to put out in a text. Those are the interesting conversations, I think, where nonfiction and fiction intersect, nonfiction and fiction. But what I was just going to quickly say in terms of writing the book, and I was 70% of the way through, and it felt like I was walking across 2 buildings on top of a tightrope. And it was like I looked down, and all of a sudden I saw all my fears, I saw everything, and I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. And I spoke to my good friend Sam on the telephone, and he's a musician, and he told me, he's like, what you need to do, we're going to create you a mantra. And the mantra is called, I'm doubling down on myself. You're going to write it, put it next to your computer, and every time you have this fear, you're going to look at it. Basically, you've created all of these skills to get to this point. You've created every single skill that you've ever done in your writing career, however long that's been, you've got here. There's no reason why, if you just keep doing the work, taking the next footsteps, writing the next sentence, not looking at the peak of the mountain, but at your feet, you're going to get to where you need to go. And it might not be the genius place that you want to, that a previous chapter's gone to, but it's going to be somewhere far more interesting. And so for me, it was the process of just doing the work. Don't worry about anything else. And I was able to finish. Yeah.
There is a reason why my essay is called Climbing the Hill.
Yeah. I know.
So, but at this point, I would really like to stress that for many people, and when I hear your experience, Oliver, my heart just breaks, because I train as a teacher, and at heart, I'm still a teacher. And I want to say to everyone listening that I really do believe in the transformative power of community. That we all, as writers, can support one another, and we can find mentors, and then we also have to take care of those who come after us. And I really want to stress that it is community that we need to be working towards, taking care of. I really believe this.
Yeah, absolutely. More than anything. Yeah.
Can I introduce somebody? This is my desk god. Eileen, do you recognize him?
Is he no, I can't really. Can you tell us?
He's the old man who moved the mountain, and the foolish old man who moved the mountain. And it's a Chinese parable about which Mao really loved. And it was, so in the late 70s and early 80s, they were still making quite beautiful foolish old men. I don't know if you can get them anymore, but it's basically this guy. In Chinese feng shui, a mountain should be at the back of your house and water in the front. And he had a mountain in the front of his house. So he started digging the mountain, and people were like, foolish old man, you're never going to be able to move that mountain. And he said, yes, but my children will keep digging and my grandchildren will keep digging. And it's this kind of parable of persistence. But of course, it does raise the question, why didn't he just move it around?
It's very good, isn't it?
So for me, he sort of represents perfectionism, persistence, and the ridiculousness of the endeavor all at once.
For me, it actually says something else. It says something about the Western notion of individualism. And the Eastern, of course, it's a huge generalizations, but the West has 3 to 5 year plans, and it's all about the individual. Whereas for me, coming from the East, I have this sense of my place in a much larger context, that I am only here on this earth for a very short period of time, and I have my part to play. And I will play my part to the best of my ability. And then it's not about me. It's never about me. It's about what I can do as a custodian of these words, or of these experiences, and of this time for the next generation and the next generation after that. And I know it's a little bit naive, but I really do believe in it. Here is my little table god, and it's a little quote from Gauguin: I shut my eyes in order to see. And this is, I think, what I mean when I say I don't really need a physical space. The space for a poet, or for me as a poet, is the space that's in my head, that you have to protect. As a writer, you must protect that, and not in a egotistical I'm a writer manner. And I feel like with Oliver, the only reason why you were able to come back to writing was the letting go of the preconception of what a writer should be. When you accepted, and it was only when you accepted that you know, you were tabula rasa, that you had to start from nothing again.
Yep.
And I started from nothing as a poet because I went into Judy Beveridge's class, and within the second lesson, I realized, oh no, you know, she's going to find out I'm a complete fraud. I've got no clue. And because I'd studied poetry and writing, and I taught poetry, and I thought I knew everything. And I went into her class and I realized I know nothing. And the minute I accepted that negative space, which is the Japanese notion of ma, when there is a negative space, then knowledge can come and fill the well. Because if the vessel is full, nothing fills it because it already thinks it's full. So, you know, the constant kind of remembering to empty the self and to stay teachable, I think is what I'm trying to say. That every day that the bowl is empty and we fill this bowl. And this is a reference to Jane Hirschfield, the poet. You know, the poem is called The Bowl.
Or the Chinese essayist from the early 20th century, Feng Zikai, who's also a sketch artist and poet. And he always used to talk about, he was a Buddhist, and he used to talk about preserving the childlike heart as the essence of creativity.
I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
I love both of those notions, and I've never heard of teachable before, but staying teachable, so it sounds like a good thing to be at the end of the day. Once you get, I'm going to stay teachable today. That's fantastic. I'm conscious of the time, and we've sped through until 3 o'clock, and I'm just wondering now whether, Sam, do you want to wrap things up for us? We've had a great time having a chat.
You have had such a great time having a chat. Thank you all so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I've just got one quick question. We only actually have time for one question, but I think it's quite an interesting question. So earlier you were kind of talking about censorship a little bit, self-censorship, and someone's asked, is there ever a good time for a writer to self-censor?
Probably if it's going to save your life. But, you know, so some of the writers I admire the most in China and also Soviet Union and all this are the people who refused to self-censor and paid a huge price. I don't know if I could resist that kind. I mean, they went to the gulag, they went to prison, they lost their lives. These, you know, I think that self-censorship under those circumstances is completely forgivable, and the ability to not self-censor is unbelievably admirable. But I think we have to ask ourselves why we would ever self-censor if we're not in that kind of position.
For me, it's about responsibility to others as well. I've written poems where, you know, I have had the urge to write about an experience, and then after I've written the poem I realized this is not my experience to write about, and I've written it for myself, and then it goes in the bottom drawer. It will never see light of day because it's not my story to tell, full stop. And that is that censorship, or is that being responsible? You know,
that's where I didn't consider that to be censorship. I thought that fell under the ethical thing that we were talking about before. Yeah.
I would only add, I think that you know, you can take anyone's life if you're talking about stories, and you could have multiple truths that you could say one thing and not another. You could say the other thing and not that, and you could have two very different looks at what a person or a situation would look like. As a writer, I don't think you're under any sort of moral obligation to tell everything about who you are and about a situation by the sheer virtue that it would be impossible. And also that by doing so, I don't want to say like to throw yourself or someone else under the bus, but I think let's just say it comes back to that idea of respect. And if you're writing about someone and you're making someone else look bad and there's no reason for it, that's not good writing. And it's not going to help anyone or the story.
Can I just add something? When I wrote my memoir and biography of a Chinese pop star, Monkey and the Dragon, I went to Taiwan and translated the entire book for the person I was writing about, because it had many details of his personal life, our friendship, all these things that I knew about that he had privileged me to know. He'd given me everything and we'd been very good friends. The only thing, and some things made him look really bad because he did some really silly things, but The only thing he asked me to take out, and I did, was a story that made someone else look a little bit foolish. That person had been a friend of ours and had become his enemy for political reasons, and had been really mean to him, and yet he was conscious of that story possibly making that person, he said, so and so is very conscious of their image, I don't think you should publish that. And that was somebody who he'd had a really bad time with. I thought that was just brilliant, and I took it out.
It's also, I think, cultural responsibility. I still am, I suppose, part of a project where I interview people and turn their life stories into poems. And I spent a long time interviewing a wonderful Maori man. And I wrote the poem, and, you know, I went through it with him, and he looked at it, he said he really loved it. And then a week later he came back, he said, I'm not comfortable with this aspect of the poem. And I said, is there anything I can change? He said, no, I feel like the spirits don't want you to tell the story. And no matter how good the poem is, it was a good poem, you know, no matter how good the poem is, no matter how good the art is, it's not worth causing anyone pain for me. Full stop. And that's my hard line.
Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, you're on mute.
Mute.
Sam.
Sorry, everyone. Rookie mistake. I was saving you all the background noise. But on that note, we're actually out of time. So thank you all so much. It's been such a fascinating talk, and I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. I would like to again thank the Sydney Review of Books for publishing you all. It's brilliant. And we look forward to upcoming editions of their works. And thank each of you for being so willing and for sharing such great stories. Hopefully we'll see you all again soon in person, if not online. But for the meantime, thanks all. See you later, and goodbye to everyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you, everyone.
Yes,
Fantastic.
bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.